In most workplaces, the loudest person in the room often gets the most attention. They speak quickly, they interrupt confidently, they fill silence before it settles. They volunteer opinions before others finish forming theirs. And for a while, it works. They appear decisive, they appear bold, they appear influential. But attention is not the same as respect. Attention is immediate. Respect is cumulative. Attention can be captured with volume. Respect is built through consistency. Many professionals make a critical mistake early in their careers. They equate visibility with authority. They believe that to be taken seriously, they must speak more, react faster, assert harder. So they raise their tone in meetings. They over-explain their ideas. They defend every point with intensity. And ironically, the more they try to appear strong, the more reactive they look. Workplace respect operates differently. It follows structure, not noise. It follows composure, not speed. It follows behavioral signals that communicate stability under pressure. When someone remains steady while others rush, people notice. When someone speaks less but with precision, people listen more carefully. When someone does not flinch under scrutiny, their presence becomes heavier. There is a psychological dynamic at play in professional environments. Every meeting, every interaction, every negotiation is an assessment of stability. Colleagues and managers unconsciously ask, does this person move easily? Do they react under pressure? Do they need approval? Do they defend excessively? Or do they remain composed regardless of temperature? Respect is not awarded to the person who dominates the conversation. It is awarded to the person who governs themselves within it. The Stoics understood something that applies directly to modern work culture. Control of self precedes influence over others. You cannot control office politics. You cannot control corporate hierarchy. You cannot control how quickly promotions happen. But you can control your pacing, your tone, your boundaries, and your reactions. And those variables shape perception. If you are easily rushed, you appear uncertain. If you are easily irritated, you appear unstable. If you overtalk to fill silence, you appear insecure. But if you regulate your tempo, if you allow silence to breathe, if you answer questions without visible defensiveness, you project something far more valuable than loud confidence. You project executive composure. In this video, we're not talking about being dominant. We're not talking about overpowering co-workers. We're not talking about aggressive alpha posturing. We're talking about 5 precise behavioral shifts that quietly increase your authority at work without raising your voice, without becoming confrontational, and without performing confidence. Because in professional environments, the person who controls the temperature of the room eventually controls the direction of it. And temperature control begins with you. Before we get into the specific moves, we need the right frame. Because without the right internal posture, the techniques will feel artificial. Workplace authority is not a performance, it is regulation. Executive presence begins internally. It is the ability to remain measured when timelines tighten, when someone challenges your idea publicly, when a senior leader questions your judgment, or when a colleague subtly competes for visibility. Most professionals lose authority not because they lack skill, but because their emotional state becomes visible under pressure. The Stoics practice something that translates directly into corporate environments. Govern your impressions before you respond to them. An impression is that immediate emotional hit you feel when something triggers you. The irritation when interrupted, the anxiety when put on the spot, the defensive surge when criticized. If you respond from that first impulse, your reaction leads the interaction, and reactive energy lowers perceived authority. In high-level environments, composure is currency. Leaders are not evaluated only on their ideas, they are evaluated on their steadiness. Can they handle disagreement without visible agitation? Can they receive criticism without collapsing or escalating? Can they stay calm when others speed up? Workplace dynamics are subtle. Status negotiations happening in real time. Pace, tone, posture, and timing all communicate where you stand internally. If you rush your speech, you signal urgency. If you over-justify your position, you signal doubt. If you smile nervously after being challenged, you signal insecurity. But if you slow down instead of speeding up, if you pause instead of scrambling, if you respond instead of react, you change the perception entirely. This is not manipulation, it is discipline. You cannot control office politics. You cannot control who talks over you. You cannot control who tries to take credit. But you can control your tempo. You can control your facial reactions. You can control how much you explain and how much you let silence work for you. When your internal state is stable, external interactions feel different. People sense that you are not easily moved. And when someone is not easily moved, they are harder to undermine. Executive presence is rarely about volume. It is about containment. Containment of emotion, containment of reaction, containment of unnecessary explanation. Once you understand that respect at work follows stability, not noise, the strategy shifts. You stop trying to win moments. You start structuring perception, and structured perception compounds over time. Move number 1, slow your speech in meetings. Speed is often mistaken for intelligence. People who speak quickly appear sharp, energetic, and decisive. But in professional environments, excessive speed signals something else: internal urgency. And urgency often reads as insecurity. When you speak too fast, you compress your authority. Your ideas may be strong, but the delivery feels reactive. It feels like you're trying to get everything out before someone interrupts you. It feels like you're persuading instead of stating. Slowing your speech changes the dynamic immediately. When you reduce your pace slightly, not dramatically, just enough, you introduce weight. Your words land instead of rushing past. You allow space between thoughts. That space signals control. There's a psychological reason this works. People associate calm pacing with confidence. Someone who is certain does not need to rush. Someone who feels secure does not need to cram every point into a single breath. Think about high-level executives you've observed. They don't accelerate under pressure. If anything, they slow down when the room becomes tense. That slowing creates contrast, and contrast draws attention. In meetings, especially when presenting ideas, speak in measured sentences. Finish one thought fully before starting the next. Let silence sit for half a second after an important point. That micro-pause forces others to process what you said, instead of interrupting instinctively. Slower speech also protects you from filler language. Words like "just," "kind of," "maybe," and "I think" often creep in when someone feels rushed. When you slow down, you eliminate those softeners. Your statements become clearer. For example, instead of saying "I just think maybe we could kind of adjust the timeline," you say calmly, "We should adjust the timeline." Same idea, different authority. This move is subtle, but it compounds. When you consistently control your pace, others begin to match it. They interrupt less. They listen longer. They respond more carefully. Speed invites competition. Calm pace invites attention. And in professional settings, attention delivered through composure builds far more respect than attention captured through volume. Control your tempo, and you quietly control the room's rhythm. Move number 2, finish your sentences when interrupted. Interruptions in the workplace are rarely accidental. Sometimes they are enthusiasm. Often they are dominance testing. And how you respond to interruption shapes your perceived authority more than the original idea you were sharing. Most people do one of two things when interrupted. They either stop immediately and surrender the floor, or they talk over the interrupter and escalate the tension. Both responses cost you something. The first signals that your contribution is negotiable. The second signals that you are reactive. There is a third option. When someone interrupts you, do not speed up. Do not apologize. Do not disappear. Maintain your tone and continue your sentence to completion. Calmly. You do not raise your volume. You do not sharpen your tone. You simply keep speaking at the same pace until your thought is finished. Then you stop. This does two things instantly. First, it communicates that your voice is not easily displaced. Second, it avoids public confrontation. You are not calling them out. You are not shaming them. You are not escalating. You are reinforcing structure. If the interruption persists, you can add one simple line without emotion. Let me finish. Not aggressive, not irritated, just direct. Most people will adjust immediately because the signal is clear. You are not combative, but you are not yielding. The Stoic principle here is self-command under pressure. The interruption may trigger irritation internally. That first impulse might be to react sharply, but composure strengthens the signal. When you remain steady instead of reactive, you preserve authority. There's also a reputational effect in group settings. Observers notice who collapses under interruption and who calmly maintains presence. Consistency builds perception. If you regularly allow yourself to be talked over, that pattern becomes normalized. If you consistently finish your thoughts, others adapt to that boundary. Respect often follows predictable enforcement. Finishing your sentence without apology does not make you difficult. It makes you clear, and clarity is professional strength. When your ideas are delivered to completion consistently, people begin to wait for them. That shift is subtle, but once it happens, interruptions decrease. Not because you demanded silence, because you modeled steadiness. Move. Number 3, stop over-explaining your decisions. This is where many capable professionals quietly lose authority. Over-explaining usually comes from a good place. You want to be transparent. You want to avoid misunderstanding. You want people to feel included in your reasoning. But when explanation turns into justification, the signal changes. The more you defend a decision, the more negotiable it appears. In meetings, this often sounds like, "I chose this direction because I thought maybe it would help with the timeline, and I just didn't want us to run into delays, and I considered a few other options too." Notice the tone. The intention is clarity. The signal is uncertainty. When you've made a considered decision, state it cleanly. "We're moving the deadline to Friday to ensure quality." Full stop. If someone asks for clarification, you provide it. But you do not preemptively defend every possible objection. Over-explaining does 3 subtle things that lower authority. First, it invites unnecessary debate. The more detail you expose up front, the more angles exist for critique. Second, it signals internal doubt. Even if you don't feel uncertain, excessive explanation can make it sound like you're seeking approval. Third, it drains energy. The room begins focusing on how you're delivering the message instead of the message itself. The Stoic discipline here is containment. Say what is necessary, no more. This does not mean being rigid or closed off. It means distinguishing between clarity and insecurity-driven elaboration. When challenged, you do not rush to defend your entire thought process. You respond proportionally. If someone says, "Why did you decide that?" you answer directly and briefly. You do not spiral into justification. There is power in clean statements. In corporate environments, leaders are not evaluated by how thoroughly they defend themselves. They are evaluated by how decisively they communicate direction. And decisiveness does not require aggression. It requires trust in your own reasoning. When you stop over-explaining, you remove the subconscious signal that your decision needs validation. And once that signal disappears, respect increases naturally. Because calm clarity feels strong, and strength rarely sounds frantic. Move number 4, use controlled eye contact strategically. Eye contact in professional settings is one of the most underestimated authority signals. Too little, and you appear uncertain. Too intense, and you appear aggressive. The balance communicates confidence without force. Many professionals break eye contact too quickly when challenged. A senior leader questions their idea, and their gaze drops to the table. A colleague pushes back and they begin scanning the room. These micro-movements seem minor, but they signal discomfort. Controlled eye contact does something different. When someone challenges you, you hold their gaze calmly while listening. You don't stare, you don't glare. You simply remain steady. Then you respond without breaking that composure. This subtle steadiness communicates emotional stability. It signals that you are not intimidated, not flustered, not scrambling internally. There is also strategic power in shifting eye contact intentionally. When you make a key point in a meeting, look at the person whose buy-in matters most. Hold the contact for a beat after you finish speaking. That pause reinforces weight. When someone interrupts you, maintaining eye contact while finishing your sentence reinforces presence. You are not escalating, you are anchoring. The Stoic principle here is awareness of perception without obsession over it. You are not performing dominance. You are simply removing signs of insecurity. Eye contact also reduces the likelihood of being talked over repeatedly. People subconsciously hesitate to interrupt someone who appears grounded and visually engaged. But the key word is controlled. Nervous eye contact, rapid shifts, exaggerated staring, darting glances undermines the effect. The goal is natural steadiness. Practice this deliberately. When speaking, lift your gaze instead of looking down at notes continuously. When listening, maintain attention rather than scanning for approval cues from others. Attention signals presence, and presence signals authority. In professional environments, those who remain visually steady under pressure often appear more composed than those who speak the loudest. Control your gaze, and you subtly reinforce control over the interaction itself. Because in meetings, confidence is often seen before it is heard. Move number 5. Respond to criticism without an emotional spike. This is where workplace authority is either solidified or weakened in seconds. Criticism, especially public criticism, triggers a physiological reaction. Your heart rate rises, your body tightens, your mind races to defend. That first internal surge is automatic. What matters is what you do next. Most professionals react in one of two ways. They become defensive and argue immediately, or they collapse slightly, over-apologize, and try to repair their image. Both responses communicate instability. The alternative is composure. When someone critiques your work in a meeting, your first move is not to defend. It is to pause. Let them finish. Maintain steady posture, then respond evenly. That's a fair point. I see what you're saying. Let's look at that. Notice what's happening. You are not conceding authority. You are not admitting failure automatically. You are acknowledging input without losing equilibrium. Then, if clarification is needed, you provide it calmly and concisely. No over-explaining, no visible agitation. The Stoic discipline here is separating ego from evaluation. Criticism is data, not identity. If you treat it as a personal attack, your reaction becomes emotional. If you treat it as information, your response becomes strategic. There's also a reputational effect. In professional environments, people watch how others handle pressure. If you remain steady under critique, your credibility increases. You appear mature. You appear secure. You appear leadership-ready. But if your tone sharpens or your body language tightens visibly, observers register volatility. Volatility reduces trust. Calm evaluation builds it. There is another subtle benefit. When you do not react emotionally, the person delivering criticism often moderates their tone. Aggression rarely escalates when it meets stability. Over time, colleagues learn something about you. You cannot be rattled easily. That perception alone reduces unnecessary confrontation. In the workplace, authority is less about having perfect ideas and more about handling imperfect moments well. Anyone can look confident when praised. Real executive presence shows when challenged. And if you can regulate yourself in that moment, respect compounds quietly. Here's what most people miss. None of these moves work once. They work because they are repeated. Authority in the workplace is not built in a single meeting. It is built through micro-consistency. The way you speak today must match the way you speak next week. The way you handle interruption must remain steady across environments. The way you respond to criticism cannot fluctuate based on who delivers it. People do not respect intensity. They respect predictability. If one day you're composed and the next day you're visibly irritated, your signal becomes unstable. Colleagues begin testing again. They aren't necessarily malicious. They're calibrating. Consistency closes that calibration loop. When you always slow your speech instead of rushing, others adapt to your tempo. When you always finish your sentence calmly, interruptions decrease. When you consistently avoid over-explaining, your statements carry more weight. When you maintain steady eye contact, people feel your presence more clearly. When you respond to criticism without visible agitation, your credibility strengthens over time. Each instance seems small, but repeated over months, the perception compounds. This is the Stoic principle of discipline in action. Not dramatic displays, not emotional dominance, just steady execution. In professional environments, people unconsciously map behavioral patterns. If your pattern is controlled, your reputation becomes controlled. If your pattern is reactive, your reputation becomes reactive. There is also an internal benefit. When you behave consistently, you begin trusting yourself more. You don't walk out of meetings replaying moments of emotional reaction. You don't regret defensive comments. You don't feel drained from overperforming. Composure reduces cognitive residue, and reduced residue improves clarity in future decisions. Micro-consistency is quiet, but it's powerful. It transforms these 5 moves from tactics into identity. You're no longer trying to appear confident. You simply operate at a stable baseline. And stability over time is what colleagues interpret as leadership potential, not volume, not charisma, stability. Here's the truth about workplace respect. It is engineered, not demanded. You cannot force colleagues to respect you. You cannot argue your way into authority. You cannot out-volume the room into credibility. But you can structure your behavior so consistently that respect becomes the natural response. When you control your pace, you slow the room. When you finish your sentences, you reinforce presence. When you stop over-explaining, you signal decisiveness. When you use steady eye contact, you anchor interactions. When you respond to criticism without emotional spikes, you demonstrate maturity. None of this requires aggression. None of it requires dominance. None of it requires personality transformation. It requires regulation. The Stoics believed that power begins with mastery of self. In corporate environments, that mastery translates into executive composure. You are not trying to win every exchange. You are shaping how you are perceived over time. Respect follows stability because stability reduces risk. Teams trust people who do not swing emotionally. Leaders promote individuals who remain measured under pressure. Colleagues defer to those who don't scramble when challenged. Noise attracts attention. Presence earns respect. And presence is quiet. It shows up in how you sit when others rush. It shows up in how you speak when others compete. It shows up in how you respond when others push. Over time, something shifts. Interruptions decrease. Challenges become more structured. Your ideas are heard without you fighting for airtime. Not because you demanded space, because your behavior made space around you. In professional life, authority is less about proving yourself and more about regulating yourself. And once you regulate consistently, you no longer need to be loud to be respected. If this resonated, write this in the comments: presence over noise. Because in the long run, the calm professional outlasts the loud one, and steady authority always compounds.